October 25, 1944, the Philippine Sea. At 0645 hours, a thin mist clung to the waves off the eastern coast of Samar Island. The air was heavy with salt, and the faint smell of fuel oil a mixture that meant only one thing: war was close. Dawn bled slowly through a ceiling of cloud, painting the ocean in bands of gray and silver. Out of that horizon came the shapes of ships, not the mighty fleet carriers of Halsey's Task Force 38, but the smaller, slower baby flat tops of Task Unit 77.4.3, codenamed Taffy 3. On the flag bridge of USS Fanshawe Bay, CVE-70, Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague squinted into the glare. His command wasn't built for a fleet action: 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, all guarding the amphibious invasion forces at Leyte Gulf. Their job was close air support and anti-submarine patrols, not a slugging match. Their aircraft, Grumman FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers, were dependable but lightly armed compared to the Hellcats and Helldivers of the fast carriers. Their destroyers, like USS Johnston DD-557 and USS Hoel DD-533, carried 5-inch guns and 10 torpedo tubes, but their hulls were thin. Sailors called them tin cans for a reason. At 0647, a voice crackled over the TBS radio circuit. Enemy fleet sighted bearing 215, range 30 miles, multiple battleships and cruisers. The words hit the bridge like a shell. Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans, captain of USS Johnston, heard the report through his headset in the pilot house. He froze, then yanked his binoculars toward the southwest. Through the haze, he saw at faint glints of sunlight off distant steel and columns of black smoke crawling across the horizon. He knew instantly what it meant. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's Center Force battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers, had slipped through the San Bernardino Strait during the night. Evans's heart hammered. He'd fought off New Guinea and in the Marshalls, but nothing like this. Kurita's ships included the super battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, armed with 9 18.1-inch guns that could lob a shell 25 miles. His own ship's heaviest shell was 50 pounds. The Japanese had come for the transports at Leyte, and the only thing standing in their way was a handful of tin cans and jeep carriers. Sprague's staff quickly confirmed radar tracks: more than 20 enemy ships closing fast at 30 knots. Taffy 3 was making only 17. They had nowhere to run. The Admiral's first order was desperate but clear. Launch everything we've got. Every plane, armed or not, get them off. Aboard USS White Plains CVE-66, the flight deck trembled as Wildcats revved their Pratt & Whitney R-1830 engines. Armorers scrambled to load 500-pound bombs and 5-inch rockets, while pilots buckled into their harnesses. Many aircraft went aloft with only half loads, some with nothing but machine guns and empty racks. Meanwhile, aboard Johnston, Evans gathered his bridge crew. His face was set calm but fierce. "Gentlemen," he said, "this will be a fight against overwhelming odds. But we will do what destroyers are supposed to do: we'll attack the enemy." At 0657, the first Japanese shells screamed overhead. The horizon erupted in orange flashes as the cruisers Kumano Suzuya and Chikuma opened fire at ranges over 20,000 yards. Towering geysers of water exploded around the escort carriers, drenching the decks. Fragments of steel whined through the air. Sprague ordered smoke. One by one, the destroyers and escorts laid thick white curtains across the eastern sky, hiding the carriers behind rolling clouds of vapor. But the range was closing fast. Radar showed the lead Japanese ships just 20 miles out. Evans didn't wait for permission. He turned to his helmsman. "Left full rudder. Come to course 215. The Johnston heeled over its wake, curling white in the rising sun. "Commence firing." The 5-5-inch guns on Johnston roared, the barrels cracking like thunder in rapid succession. At 12,000 yards, Evans was aiming at a ship 10 times his weight, the heavy cruiser Kumano. His gunners scored near hits almost immediately, walking shells up her bow. Evans closed to 10,000, then 9,000 yards, well within range of Japanese secondary batteries. Range 9,000. Prepare torpedoes. The bridge quivered as another salvo landed just astern. The deckhouse shuddered, lights flickered, and a geyser of seawater swept across the aft deck. But Evans didn't flinch. "Let's give 'em some fish." At 0710, Johnston fired all 10 torpedoes from her port tubes, their wakes streaking white through the gray-green sea. Seconds later, explosions ripped through Kumano's bow, blowing it open to the sea. She dropped out of line, listing heavily. Evans shouted over the roar, "That'll slow them down." But victory came at a price. Heavy shells from Yamato and Congo straddled Johnston, peppering her with shrapnel. A 14-inch shell smashed the after-engine room, cutting power to the aft guns. Dozens of men were down. Evans limped from the shock blood on his face. The destroyer's damage control teams worked furiously, patching holes, restoring steering. The smell of cordite oil and burned paint filled the passageways. Over the sound-powered phones came the voice of a young seaman. "Captain, we can still steer from aft. Then by God, we'll keep fighting." At 0720, Evans turned Johnston back toward the smokescreen, toward the carriers she was trying to protect. Overhead, Avengers dove on Japanese cruisers, dropping depth charges and bombs from treetop height. Their pilots could see the gun flashes below, feel the concussion in their chests. "White planes, this is Johnston," Evans radioed. "We've hit one cruiser. Am engaging others. Recommend carriers make smoke and open distance." Sprague acknowledged, but knew what it meant. Evans had thrown his ship alone into a line of battleships. At 0730, Hoel and Harriman joined the charge, racing through the spray at flank speed. Together they formed a tiny wedge of American steel, plunging straight at Kurita's battle line. Behind them, destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts, Raymond, and Dennis followed their crews, bracing for a fight most knew they couldn't survive. On the Japanese flagship, Yamato Admiral Kurita watched through binoculars in disbelief. American destroyers, tiny undergunned, were charging his formation head-on. Bakayaro, one of his staff, muttered, "Crazy fools." Yet those fools were closing fast, and their torpedoes were already in the water. At 0736, Evans ordered a hard turn to port, weaving through shell splashes as 18-inch rounds fell like thunderbolts. The bridge shook, glass shattered, but Johnston kept coming. The men on her deck were soaked in sweat and smoke, their ears ringing, their throats raw from the heat. From the aft gun mount, gunner's mate Delbert W. Doran called out over the intercom, "Captain number 3 guns still firing." "We're giving them hell, sir." Evans grinned through blood and grime. "Then keep it up." The destroyer's wake carved a white scar across the sea, a symbol of defiance drawn against the face of overwhelming power. And somewhere beyond the smoke, the roar of Yamato's main batteries rolled like the voice of a god. 7:38 hours. The morning sky over Samar was now thick with smoke oil haze and the acrid taste of burning powder. To the east, the 6 escort carriers of Taffy 3 vanished behind a curtain of artificial fog, while ahead the sea flashed with the muzzle fire of more than 20 Japanese heavy guns. Outnumbered and outgunned, 3 American destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts were all that stood between Kurita's center force and the vulnerable invasion fleet at Leyte. The men on USS Johnston, USS Hoel, and USS Harriman knew the odds. Each destroyer displaced barely 2 100 tons, thin-skinned, light, and fast designed for screening duty, not slugging matches with battleships. Yet on that morning, these tin cans became something else entirely, blades drawn in desperation. Evans leaned over the chart table, the deck vibrating under his boots as shells roared overhead. His ship's radar showed at least 10 large contacts in a tight arc to the west. The range was closing 14,000 yards, 13,000 within reach of his 5-inch batteries. "Helm steady on 215, he barked. "Keep her nose toward that cruiser." A few miles north, Commander Leon S. Kintberger aboard Hoel had made the same decision. Over the voice circuit came his calm voice, "Johnston Hoel charging. We'll draw some of the heat your way." Evans's reply was immediate. "Much obliged, Hoel. Let's see how they like the bite of tin." At 0743, the sea erupted in chaos. Johnston's 5-inch guns were firing full automatic, the crews drenched in sweat and smoke, brass casings clattering across the deck. The recoil shook the thin hull with every blast. Spotters reported near hits on a cruiser's bridge structure. The gun crews cheered. But the jubilation was short-lived. A geyser rose amidships. A shell tore through the starboard side near the waterline, ripping a hole the size of a truck. The blast threw sailors from their feet. A fireball rolled through the mess deck, turning paint to vapor. Within seconds, the passageways filled with black smoke. Fire main pressure dropping, a petty officer shouted. Shift to auxiliary, came the answer from damage control. In the chaos, Evans refused to slow. The Johnston limped forward, smoke trailing from her stacks like a wounded animal that refused to die. On the Hoel, Kintberger's gunners were locked in a deadly duel with the heavy cruiser Haguro. The destroyer zigzagged through a storm of shells, waterspouts bursting higher than the mast. Every near miss hammered her hull like a giant fist. Yet she pressed on, closing the distance for a torpedo run. "Stand by tubes 1 through 5, Kintberger ordered. The men in the forward torpedo room braced themselves. At 07:55, Hoel loosed a spread of 5 torpedoes. They ran true white wakes, slicing across the gray water toward a wall of Japanese steel. Moments later, explosions rocked the horizon, 2 confirmed hits on Haguro, or possibly Chokai. For a fleeting instant, hope flickered, but vengeance followed. A full salvo from Congo's 14-inch guns straddled Hoel. One shell punched through her bridge, killing several men outright. Another smashed into the engine room, flooding it instantly. Kintberger, blood streaming down his arm, gave the order no captain ever wants to give abandoned ship. Even as she sank, Hoel's guns continued to fire. Her number 2 mount kept spitting 5-inch rounds until the sea swallowed her at 08:55. Out of 327 men, only 86 survived. Back aboard Johnston, Evans had maneuvered behind the smoke screen again, joining Herman, the only destroyer still largely intact. Commander Amos T. Hathaway, Herman's skipper, was fighting like a man possessed. His ship darted between shell splashes, firing at everything that moved: cruisers, destroyers, even battleships. "Target that bastard on the right," Hathaway shouted, pointing toward the massive silhouette of Yamato itself. At 0800, Herman fired her torpedoes at the giant. 9 white streaks raced through the surf. Yamato's lookouts spotted them too late. The Leviathan heeled violently to avoid them breaking formation. For the first time that morning, Admiral Kurita's battle line began to lose cohesion. In the confusion, American aircraft attacked again. Wildcats dove with guns blazing, riddling the decks of Japanese cruisers. Avengers came in low-dropping depth charges and 100-pound bombs, anything that could slow the enemy down. Over the radio, frantic voices cut through the static. "Taffy 3 to all aircraft, hit those cruisers. Keep them off our decks." Evans, limping from his wounds, leaned against the helm console. His left leg was half numb from shrapnel, but his eyes burned with resolve. He raised the handset to his mouth. "All engines ahead, flank. We're going back in." The helmsman stared at him. "Sir, we're already half sunk." "Then we'll fight half a ship," Evans said quietly. "Now execute." At 0810, Johnston turned once more toward the enemy, her decks littered with shell fragments, her crew bloodied but unbroken. Gun crews dragged ammunition by hand. Men from the damaged engine room joined the loaders topside. Even the wounded refused to leave their stations. As she emerged from the smoke, Japanese gunners spotted her immediately. A storm of shells bracketed the tiny ship. The first hit destroyed her bridge communications. The second tore away the number 2 gun. Evans moved to the fantail, shouting orders by voice alone. He raised his binoculars, spotting a burning cruiser in the distance, Chikuma, her stern ablaze from repeated airstrikes. Johnston's remaining guns opened up their tracers, walking across her superstructure. Chikuma's secondary batteries returned fire, hitting Johnston again and again, until she was little more than a drifting wreck. But Johnston's men would not surrender. They kept firing until their magazines ran dry. At 09:45, her engines died completely. Smoke poured from every hatch. Evans gave the final command: "Cease fire. Prepare to abandon ship." Sailors lowered rafts into an ocean slicked with oil and debris. Some refused to go staying to help the wounded. Evans was last seen standing on the stern, still shouting for his men to get clear. A few minutes later, Johnston rolled to port and slipped beneath the waves. From the water, survivors watched her disappear. Some were weeping. Others just stared at the empty sea where their captain had stood. One sailor whispered, "He fought her to the end." At that moment, even the Japanese gunners ceased fire, awed by the courage they had just witnessed. Yet the battle was not over. Kurita's mighty force, confused and bloodied, still pressed eastward, and ahead of them, the surviving escort carriers of Taffy 3 were running out of sea room. The tin cans had bought them time. But would it be enough? By 0830 hours, the eastern horizon over Samar had turned into a wall of smoke. The tiny American escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay, Kalinin Bay, Kitkoon Bay, White Plains, St. Lo, and Gambier Bay, fled eastward at their maximum speed of 17 knots, their decks alive with frantic activity. Every man aboard knew that 17 knots was less than half the pace of the Japanese battleships that pursued them. On Fanshawe Bay's flight deck, aviation machinist's mate, second-class Robert Cox, shouted over the din of engines as the next Wildcat taxied forward. "You're clear, go, go, go!" The plane's tail lifted and the fighter leapt into the smoky sky, its wheels barely missing the end of the deck. Below, armorers dragged more bombs up from the magazine, their faces streaked with sweat and grime. Admiral Sprague stood on the flag bridge, his binoculars fixed on the west. Beyond the smokescreen, the flashes of Japanese gunfire were now visible even without optics. Each orange bloom was followed seconds later by the distant howl of incoming shells. The sea erupted in tall plumes that dwarfed the tiny carriers. "Helm come to course 125, Sprague ordered. "Signal all ships to maintain evasive maneuvers and make smoke. Keep the deck cycle running." The carrier group began a wide, weaving retreat to the southeast. The only hope was to buy time for their aircraft to harass the enemy, and for help from Halsey's fast carriers to arrive if it ever did. At 0845, Yamato's guns opened up again. Each 18-inch salvo sent out shockwaves that rolled across the ocean like thunder. Shells landed among the retreating carriers, lifting columns of water hundreds of feet high. One shell struck near White Plains, its concussion tearing open the flight deck and sending men sprawling. Another burst off Kalinin Bay's port quarter, peppering her with shrapnel. Still, the carriers kept launching planes. Many of the Wildcats and Avengers were unarmed or carried only machine guns. Lieutenant Thomas L. R. Gates, flying an Avenger from Kitkoon Bay, looked down at the inferno below and muttered into his headset, "We're out of torps, boys, but we'll make noise." His turret gunner, Petty Officer William Cady, replied grimly, "Let's go scare a battleship." Their dive carried them straight into a wall of flak from Congo and Haruna. The sky flashed with bursts of orange and black, the concussions rocking the plane like a toy. Gates pressed the bomb release. Nothing happened. The rack was jammed. "We'll strafe instead," he growled, diving lower. His 50 cal guns stitched glowing lines across a Japanese cruiser's deck. Down below, the gunners on Gambier Bay were in a fight for their lives. The carrier was lagging behind the formation, her engines strained to the limit. At Oro 900 shells from the heavy cruiser, Chikuma began to find their mark. The first struck the flight deck, blowing open a hole that swallowed 2 aircraft and their crews. Another tore through the hangar deck, igniting aviation fuel. Flames roared through the ship's interior. "Fire amidships, main decks burning," someone screamed over the intercom. Damage control parties rushed in with hoses, but the pumps were losing pressure. Captain Walter V.R. Vueg on the bridge could see Japanese cruisers now clearly through his binoculars less than 10 miles away, their decks bristling with guns. "Keep firing," he ordered. The ship's 5-inch gun barked in reply, its shells splashing harmlessly short of the enemy. By 0910, Gambier Bay was dead in the water. The cruiser Chikuma closed to 10,000 yards, firing full broadsides. Every hit tore huge gaps in the thin hull. Vueg, knowing it was over, ordered his crew to abandon ship. Sailors slid down ropes into an ocean thick with oil and debris. As they drifted away, they watched their carrier heel over and sink slowly beneath the waves. It was the only American carrier ever sunk solely by naval gunfire. Yet even as Gambier Bay disappeared, her sacrifice was not in vain. Her burning wreckage and the constant smoke from destroyers' screens confused the Japanese fire control systems. Radar range-finding faltered. Shells meant for carriers overshot, splashing harmlessly beyond. On the flagship, Yamato Admiral Kurita was growing increasingly frustrated. Reports came in of torpedo tracks everywhere, phantom destroyers appearing and disappearing in the smoke, and American planes attacking from all angles. His formation was unraveling. Some captains turned north to evade non-existent threats. Others slowed to dodge torpedoes that never came. At 0920, Kurita's staff urged him to press the attack. But from his bridge, the admiral could see only chaos, burning ships, disrupted columns, and a sky swarming with aircraft. He had been under the impression that he was facing the main American carrier fleet, not a handful of escorts. Still, the pressure on Taffy 3 mounted. Kalinin Bay took a direct hit from a cruiser shell, tearing open her stern and disabling her steering. Fanshawe Bay suffered shrapnel damage that killed several men on the bridge. White Plains narrowly avoided destruction when a Japanese shell detonated prematurely above her deck, showering the area with fragments. The air was filled with noise, the shriek of shells, the roar of engines, the screams of wounded men, and the hammering of guns. Yet within that chaos, something extraordinary had taken shape. A defense so stubborn that even the most powerful fleet in the Imperial Navy could not break it. At 0935, Admiral Sprague looked down at the chart table. The Japanese line was fractured with cruisers veering west and destroyers scattered. Smoke and confusion blanketed the sea. He turned to his staff and said quietly, "They're hesitating." The communications officer looked up, bewildered. "Sir," Sprague pointed west. "They've lost their nerve. Keep them guessing." He ordered more smoke, more airstrikes, and continued evasive maneuvers. The ragged remnants of Taffy 3 held the line by illusion and sheer will. Over the radio, Sprague sent one of the most famous transmissions of the war. "This is Taffy 3. My situation is critical, but we are still engaging the enemy. Request immediate air support. The outcome is uncertain." Above the carnage, dozens of returning Avengers, some running on fumes, formed up for another desperate attack. In the words of one pilot, "We were out of ammo, out of fuel, and out of time, but not out of courage." As the morning wore on, that courage would prove decisive. The Japanese advance began to falter, not because of superior weapons or numbers, but because a handful of men refused to break. By 0940 hours, the sky above Samar resembled a storm made of fire and steel. The eastern sun was lost behind a screen of oily smoke rising from the crippled escort carriers. The air reeked of cordite, burned paint, and aviation fuel. The sea itself boiled where shells had struck moments before, sending up steam and fragments of shattered metal. The remnants of Taffy 3 were still under relentless fire, but the tone of the battle had changed. The Japanese line, once a solid wall of power, had splintered. Each ship now fought its own war amid the confusion. Aboard USS Kalinin Bay, sailors manned every available weapon. Men who had never fired a gun in anger before were now at the ready, sweating, shouting, and feeding ammunition belts into the 20mm and 40mm mounts. The deck shuddered as her single 5-inch .38 gun at the stern fired again and again, smoke curling from its barrel. "Target that cruiser off the port bow," shouted the gun captain. The loader swung another shell into the breach. The gun fired, then another, and another. At 0955, a shell from Chokai struck Kalinin Bay's flight deck, blowing a 10-foot hole and setting the parked planes ablaze. Yet even as the crew fought the flames, the gun kept firing manually, with the electrical power knocked out. Sailors passed shells in a chain from the magazine to the mount, each one burning their hands from the heat. Suddenly a cheer went up. A 5-inch shell from Kalinin Bay had found its mark, a direct hit on the Japanese heavy cruiser's forward turret. Smoke and sparks burst from Chokai's bow as her gun fell silent. Moments later, bombs from 2 Avengers finished the job, setting the cruiser ablaze. She would soon sink, victim of an escort carrier's stubborn defiance. Meanwhile, the destroyer escort, USS Samuel B. Roberts, DE-413, nicknamed the destroyer escort, that fought like a battleship, charged into the maelstrom. Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland knew his ship had no armor and only 2 5-inch guns, yet he gave the order that would become legend. "For all hands, this will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. At flank speed, Samuel B. Roberts accelerated through the smoke guns blazing. Her crew worked with machine-like precision, loading and firing as fast as human arms could move. They closed to within 8,000 yards of a heavy cruiser, either Chikuma or Chokai, and opened fire with armor-piercing shells. "Range 8,000, direct fire," shouted the fire control officer. Every round found its mark. The Japanese cruiser's topside erupted in flames. In reply, 8-inch shells screamed back, ripping great gashes through the Roberts' thin hull. One round struck just forward of the bridge, killing half the gun crew. Still, the survivors dragged the wounded aside and kept firing. Then Copeland ordered torpedoes. His helmsman turned the ship broadside, exposing her fully to enemy fire just long enough to launch 3 torpedoes. At least one struck home. The cruiser slowed, smoke pouring from her superstructure. Roberts turned again, weaving through splashes from battleship salvos, her crew cheering each near miss as if it were a victory. One sailor yelled into the wind, "Come on, you sons of bitches, you can't hit a barn door." For a time it seemed he was right, but the weight of fire was too great. At 10:10, a shell from Congo tore through the engine room, killing power and setting off secondary explosions. Flames consumed the aft section. Copeland gave the order to abandon ship. As the men went overboard, they looked back to see their little ship still afloat, guns silent, but hull defiantly upright. One sailor later said, "She died like a hero standing tall." All across the sea, similar acts of defiance played out. USS Hirman, the last surviving destroyer of the screen, continued to duel with both Yamato and Nagato, the 2 most powerful battleships afloat. Her gunners, drenched and deafened, fired until their gun barrels glowed red. A near miss flooded the forward compartments, but Hirman refused to yield her crew, sealing bulkheads with whatever they could find: mattresses, wood, even clothing. At 10:30, a formation of Avengers from Fanshawe Bay returned for yet another run. Most were out of bombs. Some carried only a few rockets or depth charges. Still, they pressed in, attacking the cruisers that threatened the carriers. The radio chatter was frantic but fearless. "Taffy 3, this is Bearcat 24, making torpedo run on cruiser dead ahead." "Roger, Bearcat. Give 'em hell." Lieutenant Jack M. Harper, flying from St. Lo, dropped his last 100-pound bomb squarely on the deck of Suzuya, igniting her torpedo racks. The explosion tore through the cruiser, killing hundreds and forcing her to withdraw. By 1100, the sea was littered with wrecks, American and Japanese alike. Johnston was gone. Hoel was gone. Samuel B. Roberts was sinking. Gambier Bay had vanished beneath the waves. Yet miraculously, the Japanese advance had halted. On Yamato's bridge, Admiral Kurita stared east through the smoke. His staff begged him to continue. The way to Leyte was open, but all he could see were columns of smoke, splashes of torpedoes, and the relentless swarm of American planes. His flagship had narrowly avoided multiple torpedo attacks. His cruisers were burning. His men were exhausted. He asked no one in particular, "Where is the enemy fleet?" There was no answer. At 11:15, Kurita made the decision that would baffle historians for decades. He ordered his fleet to turn north, away from Leyte Gulf, away from victory. The ships of the Imperial Navy began to withdraw, battered, smoking, and confused. Back among the Americans, the exhausted survivors of Taffy 3 stared westward as the enemy turned away. Some thought it was a trick. Others simply wept. The nightmare had lasted 4 hours, yet it felt like forever. Over the TBS, Admiral Sprague's voice came through, hoarse but triumphant. "God bless those little destroyers. They saved us all." The battle off Samar, the most desperate surface action in American naval history, was over. But the sea still burned, and thousands of men still fought to survive the aftermath. By noon on October 25, 1944, the thunder of the guns had faded into a dull, disbelieving hush. The water east of Samar was a graveyard of smoke and flame, drifting oil slicks glinting under a sun, now high and pitiless in the sky. Hundreds of sailors clung to rafts or floating debris, staring in shock at the distant silhouettes of the Japanese fleet turning away. From the battered bridge of USS Hirman, Commander Amos Hathaway could scarcely believe what he was seeing. Through the jagged remains of the bridge glass, He watched the massive shapes of Yamato Kongo and Nagato receding westward. Their wakes were wide and white, curling back toward the San Bernardino Strait. The enemy was retreating. For 4 hours, these men had fought against impossible odds, destroyers and escort carriers facing down the largest battleships ever built. And somehow, impossibly, the enemy was the one breaking contact. Hathaway gripped the railing, his hands trembling. His ship was half sunk, her decks cratered and smoking, but she was still afloat. He turned to his gunnery officer and said quietly, almost to himself, "I think they've had enough." A mile astern, the flagship Fanshawe Bay wallowed through the oily swells, her decks blackened and torn. Admiral Clifton Sprague stood near the open bridge wing, staring at the horizon where Kurita's fleet had vanished into haze. He didn't speak for a long time. Around him, crewmen were cheering, crying, or just collapsing where they stood. One officer murmured, "Sir, they're retreating. We made it." Sprague finally lowered his binoculars. "We didn't make it," he said softly. They did. Below decks, corpsmen moved through the carnage, bandaging wounds with what supplies remained. The sick bay overflowed. Men lay on stretchers down the passageways. The air smelled of iodine and blood. Many of the wounded asked the same question, did we stop them? Each time the answer came, yes, we did. But for hundreds of others, the battle wasn't over. It had only entered a new phase, the long, merciless struggle to survive in the open sea. The men, adrift north and west of the surviving ships, oil fires burned in wide slicks where the Johnston, Hoel, and Samuel B. Roberts had gone down. Among the drifting debris, clusters of survivors huddled on makeshift rafts, planks, life jackets, floating barrels, anything that could keep them above water. The sea was deceptively calm now, gentle swells rocking them in rhythm. But beneath that calm lay exhaustion, thirst, and the unrelenting tropical sun. Gunner's mate Delbert Doran, one of Johnston's survivors, floated with a small group about 50 miles off Samar. His skin was blistered, his uniform in tatters. Around him, wounded men moaned softly. The oil on the surface clung to their faces and stung their eyes. "Keep your heads up," Doran whispered. "Help's coming." He didn't know if he believed it. Nearby, Seaman Raymond Koss had tied 2 life jackets together to keep his unconscious shipmate afloat. Every few minutes, he dunked his cap in the water and dripped it over the man's cracked lips. The horizon was empty in all directions, just the shimmer of heat and the faint smell of burning fuel. Hours passed. The sounds of battle faded completely, replaced by the slap of waves and the buzzing of flies drawn from the corpses nearby. Some men prayed. Others cursed. One muttered, "We stopped them, but what's the point if nobody knows we're here?" Back aboard the carriers, radio operators sent frantic distress calls. Rescue aircraft were requested, but the sky was still thick with scattered Japanese fighters and bombers from other sectors of the battle. It would take time for search planes to arrive, time the men in the water didn't have. Kurita's unraveling. Aboard Yamato, Admiral Takeo Kurita sat alone in his stateroom, the steady thrum of the engines echoing through the bulkheads. His officers avoided his gaze. He had lost 4 cruisers and suffered heavy damage across his fleet. But more than that, he had lost the initiative. Why had he withdrawn? Historians would debate the question for generations. Some said he believed he was facing Halsey's main carrier task force, not a handful of escort ships. Others argued that the relentless attacks, torpedoes, dive bombers, smoke screens, had created an illusion of strength. What is certain is this Kurita's fleet had been poised to crush the American landing at Leyte, to change the course of the Pacific War. Yet as noon turned to afternoon, the Japanese battleships steamed back toward the San Bernardino Strait, leaving the invasion force untouched. Kurita's final signal to Tokyo that day read simply, "Enemy air attacks heavy. Situation confused. We'll regroup." To his subordinates, it felt like defeat disguised as prudence. To the men of Taffy 3, it was salvation. The price of victory. By mid-afternoon, the surviving American ships began gathering their wounded and assessing the damage. Kalinin Bay, trailing a plume of smoke, had taken 20 direct hits. Heermann had flooded compartments fore and aft. Fanshawe Bay had over 200 casualties. The air was filled with the sound of repair crews hammering, cutting, and welding a shipyard in the middle of the Pacific. Admiral Sprague composed a brief message for transmission to higher command, engaged major portion of enemy fleet with all available units. Situation improving. Many casualties. Request medical and rescue assistance. It was a masterpiece of understatement. At 1600 hours, the first PBY Catalina search planes appeared overhead, circling low over the battle area. Crewmen on the carriers waved smoke flares to mark survivor positions. The aircraft dropped rafts and survival kits, their pilots radioing coordinates to rescue destroyers inbound from Leyte Gulf. For the men in the water, the sight of those planes was salvation. Weak voices shouted, "Over here!" Some wept openly. Others simply lay back and stared at the sky, too tired to move. The rescue effort would continue into the night and through the following day. Many would be found, but not all. Of Johnston's crew of 327, only 141 survived. From Hoel, 86 were pulled from the sea. Samuel B. Roberts lost 90 of her 224 men. For many of those who perished, their final resting place would be this stretch of ocean, their graves marked only by the rolling swells and the silence that followed the storm. The battle that should never have been. As the last fires died out over Samar, the truth of what had happened began to settle in. A few escort carriers, 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts had faced down the core of Japan's surface fleet, and won not by strength, but by audacity. No admiral's war plan had ever called for such a thing. The destroyers of Taffy 3 were supposed to protect the carriers, not charge headlong at battleships. The carriers were supposed to retreat, not turn into forward airbases under shell fire. Yet in that chaos, discipline and instinct fused into something extraordinary. A spontaneous, coordinated defiance that changed the course of the Pacific War. In later years, Admiral Sprague would write, "There was no time to think, only to act." Every man did his job. No one flinched, and that was enough. The victory at Samar was not clean, not decisive in numbers, but it broke the myth of Japanese naval invincibility. After Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Navy would never again threaten an American invasion force. The age of the battleship was over, and the world would remember the day when the so-called tin cans laughed at underestimated and thin as paper charged into hell and turned the tide of history. The following morning, October 26, 1944, dawned over the Philippine Sea with a quiet so complete it felt unreal. The thunder of the previous day's battle had vanished, replaced by the low hum of rescue aircraft and the gentle slap of waves against twisted metal. Where once warships had traded broadsides, now only wreckage floated, oil drums, shattered lifeboats, and the bodies of men who had fought to the very end. Overhead, the first light painted the water in muted gold, illuminating the sprawling debris field that stretched for miles. The PBY Catalinas of the U.S. Navy's Air-Sea Rescue Squadron crisscrossed the area in slow, deliberate patterns, their crews peering through binoculars for any sign of life. From the cockpit of one Catalina, Lieutenant J.G. Harold J. Kane leaned out of the side window, shielding his eyes from the glare. "Got movement 2 o'clock low," he called. The co-pilot banked the big seaplane toward the glint. Through the drifting smoke, they saw a cluster of men waving a tattered piece of cloth tied to an oar. Their faces were blackened with oil, their eyes hollow. Kane's voice was tight. "They're ours." The Catalina touched down roughly, bouncing across the swells. The crew tossed ropes and life rings into the water. "Hang on, boys, we've got you." Among the rescued was Chief Boatswain's Mate J.D. McCready from the Johnston. His lips were cracked, his skin raw from sun and salt. When the rescuers hauled him aboard, he tried to salute and failed. All he could whisper was, "Captain, stayed." He stayed with her. The Ghosts of Samar, by mid-morning destroyers. USS Dennis and USS Raymond joined the rescue effort, combing through miles of floating wreckage. Crewmen leaned over the rails with boat hooks, pulling survivors from the sea, many so weak they couldn't speak. Medics worked on deck, cutting away oil-soaked clothing, cleaning wounds, and giving sips of water from canteens. Every so often they found someone already gone, face turned to the sky. Sailors would quietly cover the body with a blanket and move on. There was no time to mourn. Too many still needed saving. Lieutenant Jack Harper, the Avenger pilot, who had helped sink Suzuya, circled above watching the recovery unfold. His plane's fuel gauge hovered near empty, but he refused to return to base until he'd marked every possible survivor location with smoke flares. Over the radio, his voice cracked with exhaustion. "Tell those boys down there. They're heroes. Every damn one of them." The phrase, "the heroes of Samar," began to spread through the fleet that very day. Crews on hospital ships whispered it. Men in the ready rooms of Halsey's carriers repeated it like a prayer. Messages from the abyss. That evening, Admiral Sprague composed a situation report aboard Fanshawe Bay, dictated in a low, weary voice. His clerk recorded every word by hand. "Enemy fleet retired northward. Condition of my task unit critical. Johnston, Hoel, and Roberts lost in action. Gambier Bay sunk. Remaining units severely damaged but operational. Estimate that our destroyers and aircraft stopped major enemy force from penetrating Leyte. Morale high despite heavy losses." Sprague paused. He rubbed his temples before continuing. "Make sure that last line stands," he said. "They need to know what those boys did." His words reached Admiral William F. Halsey aboard the flagship New Jersey later that night. Halsey, whose own task force had been drawn north by a Japanese decoy fleet, stared at the message for a long time. Then, according to witnesses, he muttered quietly, "They saved my flank. God help me, they saved us all." Japan's crumbling might. While the Americans scoured the sea for survivors, Admiral Takeo Kurita's battered fleet limped back toward Brunei Bay. The once proud center force was a shadow of its former strength. 4 heavy cruisers, Chikuma Chokai, Suzuya, and Kumano, had been lost or crippled. Hundreds of Japanese sailors were dead or missing. On Yamato, the crew moved in silence. Kurita stood at the chart table staring at his hands. The smell of burned cordite still clung to his uniform. His officers waited for orders, but none came. Finally, he said, "The sea has judged us." For Japan, Samar marked the end of an era. Never again would the Imperial Navy's battleships challenge the United States in open combat. The once invincible fleet, built on pride and steel, had been turned back by courage and cunning. The survivors' vigil. In the days that followed, hundreds of rescued men were brought to Leyte Gulf, where hospital tents lined the beaches. Some could walk. Others were carried on stretchers. Reporters and photographers recorded their stories, but the men themselves spoke little. Their eyes told the rest hollow from shock, haunted by the screams of friends left behind. A nurse aboard the hospital ship USS Bountiful wrote in her journal, "They came aboard burned and half dead, yet every one of them asked first, 'Did we hold them?' Only when we said yes did they close their eyes and rest." When Admiral Sprague visited the wards, men tried to sit up and salute. He told them, "Rest, boys. You've done your duty 100 times over." Some smiled weakly, others wept. The reckoning at home news of the battle reached Washington weeks later, carried in fragments. Destroyers sacrificed themselves, carriers attacked by battleships, enemy turned back. Even the hardened chiefs at the Navy Department were stunned. The after-action reports read like fiction, 3 destroyers and 4 escorts charging a fleet of 23 Japanese warships, including the largest battleship in the world, and surviving long enough to stop it. Historians would later call it the most gallant action in naval history. Admiral Sprague and his men received the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest collective honor for valor. Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans, who had gone down with the Johnston, was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the only destroyer captain in World War II to receive it. His citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." In the face of overwhelming odds, he led his ship and her men into battle against a vastly superior force and inflicted crippling damage on the enemy before being mortally wounded. When the award was announced, one of Johnston's survivors said softly, He told us we were going to attack, and we followed him because we believed him. That's all there was to it. The sea remembers, as the sun set on the second day after the battle, the Pacific grew calm again. The smoke had cleared, the wrecks sank beneath the surface. The waves rolled gently over the graves of men and ships alike, Americans and Japanese who had fought with equal courage. From the decks of the surviving carriers, sailors stood at attention for a brief ceremony. The chaplain's voice carried over the wind for those who gave their lives that others might live. May the sea cradle them forever. Bugles played over the still water. For a moment, even the gulls were silent. When the last note faded, the men turned back to their duties. Engines roared to life. The war moved on to Mindoro, to Luzon, to Okinawa. But none who had been at Samar would ever forget that morning when courage met destiny. In the war's long history, it would stand as something unique, not just a battle, but a testament. Proof that even the smallest ships in the hands of men with unbreakable will could defy the impossible. As Admiral Sprague later wrote in his report to Pacific Fleet Command, "Courage is not measured in tons of steel nor in the range of guns, but in the hearts of those who fight." At Samar, the measure was infinite. Winter 1944. The Pacific swelled dark and heavy under monsoon skies as the remnants of the once invincible Imperial Navy retreated to its shattered anchorages. The balance of the ocean war had shifted irrevocably. Yet far from Tokyo and Pearl Harbor, in the quiet corners of American bases scattered across the islands, men still whispered a single word with reverence: Samar. The legend of the tin can destroyers spread faster than official communiques. It passed from ship to ship across mess halls and radio rooms, told in fragments that grew into myth. Some swore the Johnston had charged alone into Yamato's main batteries, her guns still firing as she sank. Others said the Samuel B. Roberts had crippled a battleship before going down. The truth was even more astonishing. All of it was nearly true. Among the survivors, the memory was not legend, but scar. The survivors' silence. In late November 1944, a group of sailors from USS Hoel and USS Johnston were gathered at a Navy hospital in San Francisco. Reporters pressed for stories. How did you do it? What was it like? Most said nothing. Boatswain's mate, Joseph O'Malley, his hands still bandaged from burns, finally muttered, "We just did our job. That's all." When a journalist asked if they'd been afraid, O'Malley stared at him for a long moment and said quietly, "Every second." But the captain was more afraid of failing than dying. For many, homecoming brought its own battles. Nightmares of explosions, the cries of shipmates, the endless choking oil slick haunted their sleep. Some woke up gasping for air, certain they were back in the water. Others couldn't bear the sound of thunder or the flash of welding sparks. The Navy offered commendations, medals, and promotions, yet the men who'd lived through Samar spoke of something deeper, something words could not hold: the quiet understanding that courage had cost them more than they could ever explain. The intelligence reckoning, while the public hailed the victory, analysts at Pacific Fleet headquarters pored over reports from Sprague's task unit and Kurita's retreat. What they found astonished even seasoned officers. The Japanese center force had turned back despite overwhelming advantage. Battleships, Yamato, Nagato, Haruna, and Kongo, 10 heavy and light cruisers, and more than a dozen destroyers against 6 escort carriers and 7 screening ships. Rear Admiral Charles M. Cook, operations chief at CINC PAC, underlined one sentence in Sprague's report: "Aggressive counterattack created the illusion of greater strength." Cook circled the words "illusion of strength" 3 times. He later remarked to staff that illusion saved the invasion. "We owe the Leyte beachhead to bluff and bravery." Fleet intelligence reconstructed the sequence. Smoke screens, torpedo runs, constant radio chatter, and dozens of small air groups striking from multiple bearings. To Kurita, it must have looked like the full American fast carrier force. His hesitation was understandable but fatal. The psychological weapon wielded by the tin cans would become doctrine-offensive defense. Even when hopelessly outgunned, attack first sow confusion forced the enemy to react. Kurita's confession in post-war Japan. Years after the guns fell silent, a weary man in civilian clothes sat before an American interviewer in Tokyo Bay. It was Admiral Takeo Kurita, now retired, summoned by Allied historians seeking to understand Leyte. The translator asked the inevitable question, "Why did you turn back?" Kurita hesitated. His hands, once steady on the rail of Yamato's bridge, trembled slightly. Because he said at last, "I could not understand what I was seeing. The Americans. They charged." He looked up, eyes distant. "In our doctrine, when faced with certain destruction, a ship withdraws. But your destroyers did not withdraw. I thought there must be a trap, that no sane commander would do such a thing, unless great strength was hidden behind the smoke." He paused, voice dropping to a whisper. They were not sane. They were brave. That admission would echo through military academies for decades. The search for the lost ships. In the years following the war, the Pacific slowly reclaimed its dead. Families of the men of Johnston, Hoel, and Samuel B. Roberts waited for word that never came. The Navy listed them as lost with all hands or missing in action, but the ocean offered no closure. For half a century, their resting places remained unknown until the 21st century. In 2019, an expedition led by Caladan Oceanic discovered the wreck of USS Johnston, nearly 21,000 feet beneath the surface, the deepest known shipwreck in history. The hull lay broken but recognizable, her number 557 still faintly visible on the bow. Video footage revealed her guns still trained forward as if waiting for a final command. The world watched in silence as explorers read aloud the names of the crew. Among them, Commander Ernest E. Evans. His ship, once derided as a tin can, now rested as an icon of unshakable resolve. A survivor, now 94 years old, wept as he watched the footage. "We said she'd never stop fighting," he murmured. "And she hasn't." Courage immortalized. In 1958, the Navy dedicated a memorial at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. A bronze plaque inscribed with the words, "In memory of those destroyer men who fought at Samar, who charged into battle against overwhelming odds, and by their courage turned the tide of war." Cadets passing it would pause, tracing the engraved silhouettes of the ships. The story of Samar became required reading for every naval officer, not as a tale of tactics, but of spirit. During fleet exercises decades later, young destroyer captains still quoted Evans's final order, "We'll go in and attack. That's what destroyers are for." The phrase became an unofficial creed, whispered before deployments, engraved inside wardrooms, written on chalkboards during training. This is what destroyers are for. The meaning of Samar, even in the cold calculus of strategy, the battle off Samar defied comprehension. It was not supposed to happen yet. It did, and it changed everything. Historians called it the last great surface action in naval history, the moment when courage met the end of an era. It marked the twilight of the battleship, the rise of the carrier, and the ascendance of air power. But for the men who fought it, Samar was not about machines or doctrine. It was about the moment when men discovered the full measure of their will. Years later, at a reunion of Taffy 3 survivors, one gray-haired sailor put it best. "They said we were outgunned. Maybe so. But we weren't out of guts." He raised a glass. Around him the room fell quiet, except for the clinking of metal cups. "To the ones still out there," he said. "To the boys who never came home." Outside, the wind from the Chesapeake rippled the flags at half-mast. The sea still holds them, but their story refuses to sink. The battle off Samar had ended, but its echoes rolled across the Pacific like distant thunder. While the men of Taffy 3 were being pulled from the oily water, the invasion of Leyte pressed forward unhindered. On shore, the beaches at Dulag Palo and Tacloban crawled with men and machinery, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, tanks and trucks pouring onto Philippine soil under the relentless drone of naval air cover. The Japanese plan, codenamed Sho-Go 1, had been to crush that landing with a pincer strike, a northern decoy carrier force to draw Halsey away, and a center battleship group Caritas to fall upon the invasion fleet from behind. It might have worked. It should have worked. But the unthinkable had happened. The tin cans and escort carriers had stopped it cold. By October 27th, American supply convoys were steaming freely through Leyte Gulf. General Douglas MacArthur, standing under a makeshift canopy of camouflage netting at Tacloban, watched the endless columns of troops coming ashore and said simply, "The Navy has made good my pledge. I have returned." Few of the men around him realized how close that promise had come to breaking. The fall of Caritas' hope. Caritas' shattered fleet limped into Brunei Bay 3 days later. The mood aboard his flagship Yamato was grim. Her once flawless decks were pocked with shrapnel scars, her paint blistered from near misses. Around her, the crippled survivors Nagato Kongo Haruna and a few battered destroyers dropped anchor in sullen silence. Kurita convened his senior officers in the wardroom. The air was heavy with the stink of oil and frustration. Captain Tomeo Koyanagi, his chief of staff, presented casualty lists in a trembling hand. Thousands dead, 4 cruisers gone, several destroyers missing. "Our victory," he said bitterly, "was stolen by ghosts." Kurita said nothing for a long time. Finally he replied, "Not ghosts' courage." Then more quietly, "We lost not to strength, but to will." He knew it was over. The Japanese Navy had exhausted its fuel reserves, its trained crews, and much of its faith. The last battleship sortie in history had ended in humiliation. From then on, Japan's defense would depend on suicide planes, the kamikaze. Kamikaze rising. On October 25th, even as Kurita turned away from Samar, the first organized kamikaze attacks struck the carriers of Taffy 3. At 10:51 hours, a Japanese Zero dove out of the sun and slammed into USS St. Lo. The explosion ignited her fully loaded bomb magazine, blowing the carrier apart in a chain of fireballs visible for miles. Within minutes, the ship was gone, taking 143 men with her. It was the beginning of a new and terrible phase of the war, one born out of desperation. Lacking ships and trained pilots, Japan turned to the only resource it had left, young men willing to die. In the days that followed, American sailors watched the sky with renewed dread. It wasn't just the enemy anymore, one crewman wrote in his diary. It was death itself falling from the clouds. Despite these losses, Leyte held firm. The Japanese army launched repeated counterattacks from the mountains, but with the sea lanes secure, American reinforcements flowed ashore in a steady tide. The island became a vast supply base, a springboard for the invasion of Luzon, and ultimately Japan itself. The victory was strategic, but it had been bought at a staggering human cost. The letters home. For weeks after the battle, post offices aboard surviving ships processed hundreds of letters written by the exhausted men of Taffy 3. Some were terse. Others spilled across multiple pages, written in cramped, salt-stained handwriting. One letter later, preserved in the National Archives, came from Seaman First Class Henry Red Jacobson, aboard Kalinin Bay. "Dear Ma, you'll hear soon about what we went through. They said we were supposed to die, but somehow we didn't. I saw ships blow apart, and I saw men go into the water, and I saw others fight when they couldn't even stand. I never knew what courage looked like until that morning. If you ever see Commander Evans's family, tell them we owe him everything. Tell them we didn't run." Another came from aviation radio man Bill Cady, written aboard Fanshawe Bay while recovering from burns. "The captain says we made history. I don't know about that, but I know we made a hell of a mess. We were supposed to be running for our lives, but somehow somebody forgot to tell us to stop fighting." These letters were mailed across the country, tucked into envelopes that smelled faintly of sea salt and smoke. They reached Kansas farms, Brooklyn row houses, small-town post offices in Oregon. Parents unfolded them at kitchen tables and wept. Across the Pacific, Japan's own letters, censored and sorrowful, told of loss and futility. The ocean swallowed our pride, one Japanese midshipman wrote before his next and final sortie. The new reality. As 1945 dawned, the American Navy no longer feared the Imperial fleet. The great ships that had once terrorized the Pacific were either sunk hiding or crippled. When Yamato sailed again the following April on her final mission, Operation Ten-Go, a one-way charge toward Okinawa, she did so with almost no air cover and less than half a tank of fuel. She would not reach her destination. But the men of Taffy 3 had already written Yamato's epitaph months before in the waters off Samar. Strategically, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, of which Samar was the climactic chapter, ensured that Japan's sea power was broken forever. The Philippines campaign severed Tokyo's access to vital oil from Borneo, and the East Indies strangling its war machine. Without fuel, the empire's navy and air forces withered. And yet, in the memory of sailors and historians alike, Samar's meaning transcended logistics. It became a parable proof that even the smallest force bound by duty and faith could bend the course of history. The myth and the man. In the months that followed, Commander Ernest Evans became the embodiment of that legend. His Medal of Honor citation circulated through every fleet command. His portrait hung in destroyer wardrooms. Sailors repeated his last words, "We'll go in and attack," as a kind of benediction before battle drills. At the Naval Academy, a new generation of midshipmen learned of his tactics. The audacious torpedo run, the aggressive use of smoke, the improvisation under fire. But what they learned most was character. Lieutenant Thomas L. Gates, one of the Avenger pilots who had supported Johnston that day, later told a class of young officers, Evans didn't have better guns. He didn't have thicker armor. What he had was belief in his men, belief in the idea that courage is contagious. Once he turned toward the enemy, every ship behind him followed. That idea that leadership is moral, not mechanical, would shape naval training for decades to come. The Quiet Sea. On the first anniversary of the battle, October 25, 1945, the war was over. Japan had surrendered 2 months earlier. At Leyte, American ships anchored in the calm waters where so many had died. The sea was serene now, broken only by the hum of small boats laying wreaths on the surface. Among them were survivors from Fanshawe Bay, Kalinin Bay, and Hirman. They stood at attention as a chaplain's voice carried over the still water. They were ordinary men who did extraordinary things. Their courage outlived their ships, and their ships outlived their steel. One sailor tossed a brass shell casing into the sea, the last round he'd fired that day a year before. It struck the water with a hollow splash and disappeared. "Rest easy, skipper," he murmured. We kept the faith. As the sun dipped below Samar's western hills, the surface shimmered gold. The waves rolled on, erasing all trace of battle, yet somewhere beneath, in the dark and endless quiet, the names still lingered. Johnston, Hoel, Samuel B. Roberts, Gambier Bay. The ocean remembers. The war ended, but Samar refused to fade into the haze of history. For naval officers, scholars, and sailors alike, it became a touchstone, a case study in command morale and the physics of courage. At the U.S. Naval War College, instructors spent months dissecting the action minute by minute, plotting the desperate maneuvers of the destroyers against the ponderous lines of Kurita's battleships. They found something no textbook could fully explain: how men in fragile hulls had outthought and outfought an enemy that by all logic should have annihilated them. Rear Admiral Charles Sock McMorris, a strategist who had fought at the Komandorsky Islands, addressed a class of cadets in 1947. He stood before a large chart of Leyte Gulf, its blue lines traced with red pencil marks. "Gentlemen," he said, "you can teach tactics. You can calculate firing arcs, but you cannot measure what happened here." This, he tapped the map with a wooden pointer, was the moment when willpower became a weapon. The new age of the Navy, the lessons of Samar reshaped naval doctrine in subtle but lasting ways. The age of the battleship was gone. Even the mightiest armor proved helpless against coordinated air and torpedo assault. But beyond the technical shift, Samar taught that initiative and aggression, could compensate for numerical inferiority that the first to act often dictated the course of battle. Destroyer captains across the post-war fleet adopted a new, unofficial maxim, scrawled in chalk in wardrooms from Norfolk to Yokosuka: if you're close enough to see the enemy, you're close enough to hit him. In 1948, the Navy commissioned the destroyer USS Ernest E. Evans DD-823 in honor of the Johnston's captain. At her christening, Evans' widow Mildred broke the bottle with a trembling hand. She said only, "For the men who never came back." As the ship slid down the ways into the water, the band played "Eternal Father, Strong to Save." Sailors stood in silence. The men who carried the flame through the 1950s and 60s reunions of Taffy 3 became sacred rituals. Veterans gathered in Legion halls and hotel ballrooms, their hair graying, their hands calloused by work and time. They brought faded photographs, men laughing on deck flight crews, posing beside their Avengers letters written in pencil. At one reunion in 1964, a sailor named Jim Dyer, who had served aboard Heermann, took the podium. He held up a fragment of twisted metal painted gray and blackened with soot. This, he said, was part of our gun shield. We kept it because it reminds us we were never supposed to win. But we did. The crowd rose to its feet in applause. Some men cried openly. Others simply nodded. The Japanese perspective. Across the Pacific, the battle haunted the Japanese Navy's survivors in a different way. Former gunnery officer Matsuo Ishikawa, who had served aboard Congo, later wrote in his memoirs, "The Americans at Samar fought like cornered animals, but with the discipline of samurai. We could not believe such small ships would charge battleships. We laughed at them once. We did not laugh that day." In Japan, Kurita remained a controversial figure. Some condemned his withdrawal as cowardice. Others saw it as a rational act of mercy, saving thousands of lives in a war already lost. But among his crew, there was little bitterness. One veteran of Yamato later told an interviewer, "Our guns were bigger, but our hearts were smaller." Those little ships had the hearts of giants, rediscovering the depths. Decades passed. The Pacific rolled on indifferent and immense. Technology advanced, and with it came the means to look into places once unreachable. In the 21st century, deep-sea explorers using remote-operated submersibles began to scan the depths off Samar. In 2021, the expedition led by Victor Vescovo located the wreck of the Samuel B. Roberts, resting upright nearly 600 feet below the surface. Her hull was twisted but intact. The gun mounts were still aimed skyward. The ship's number 413 glimmered faintly in the light of the submersible. When the footage was released, surviving families gathered at the U.S. Navy Memorial in Washington to watch. Gasps and tears filled the room as the cameras panned across the rusted nameplate. Admiral Samuel Paparo, then commander of the Pacific Fleet, spoke softly afterward. "These ships still stand watch not on the surface but in memory. They are proof that valor does not rust. How Samar changed warfare. The echoes of that battle extended far beyond the Pacific." During the Cold War, strategists studying limited force engagements often cited Samar as a model for asymmetric conflict. One 1962 Navy tactical manual devoted an entire appendix to destroyer actions at Samar, emphasizing initiative under fire as the core principle of command. It concluded, "The lesson of Samar is eternal. When communications fail and orders are unclear, attack for hesitation is death." Air-sea integration doctrines, now fundamental to naval warfare, drew much from Taffy 3's improvisation. The ad hoc coordination of airstrikes, torpedo runs, and smokescreens. Modern carrier battle groups would never again be caught as unprepared as Sprague's force had been. Yet in every simulation and war game, Samar remained the unspoken standard. Could your command perform with the same clarity and courage under chaos? The personal reckonings for the survivors' life after Samar was quieter, but no less profound. Many returned to civilian life, to farms, shipyards, classrooms. Some stayed in the Navy, carrying forward the unspoken bond of men who had seen the impossible and lived. Lieutenant Tom Gates, who had flown an Avenger that day, became a commercial pilot after the war. In interviews, he said he could never again fly over open ocean without seeing the plumes of gunfire in his mind. "You don't forget what courage sounds like," he said once. "It's the sound of a man saying, 'We'll go in,' when he knows he won't come back." Others never spoke of it. A widow in Oklahoma kept her husband's Navy cap and telegram folded in a drawer for 60 years. When she died, her grandson found a note inside. "He went down with the Johnston. He died doing his duty. That's enough." A legacy cast in steel. Today, destroyers and frigates of the U.S. Navy still bear names from that day. USS Sprague, USS Johnston, USS Hoel, USS Samuel B. Roberts. Their crews know the stories. Every year on October 25th, they hold a brief remembrance at sea, no speeches, no parades. Just a moment of silence, a bell rung 3 times, and a single phrase whispered over the wind, "Taffy 3 still on station." For modern sailors navigating the same waters, the story is not ancient history, it is inheritance. The waves over Samar roll endlessly the same as they did that morning in 1944. But somewhere deep below in the eternal twilight lie the ships that proved courage can change the course of empires. The tin cans sleep in peace, but their wake still moves the sea. October 25th comes each year without ceremony to most of the world. But for those who have worn the Navy's blue, that date whispers through the fleet like a ghost signal. Somewhere on every ocean, a sailor glances west at dusk and thinks of the men of Taffy 3. Time has thinned their ranks. The last living witnesses are old now men with steady eyes and trembling hands who still wake to the sound of phantom gunfire in their sleep. Yet even as age bends their backs, their memories remain razor-sharp, the shriek of incoming shells, the tremor of the deck under full salvo, the impossible sight of destroyers charging giants. When they speak to cadets and schoolchildren, they do not boast. They talk about fear. Courage, says former signalman George F. Riley, isn't being fearless. It's steering into it anyway. And when the young ask what it felt like to face Yamato, Riley just shakes his head. You don't feel much. You just act. The thinking comes later if you're lucky enough to get later. The living classroom. At the Naval Academy Museum in Annapolis, a permanent exhibit stands in a quiet alcove. Behind glass are fragments of twisted hull plating, recovered from Kalinin Bay and Herman, a rusted binocular case from Johnston, and a scorched signal flag, the one Sprague ordered hoisted when smoke obscured radio contact attack and protect the carriers. Visitors linger longest at the Wall of Faces. Grainy photographs stare back boys in white uniforms, most not yet 20. Some grin broadly. Others seem shy, as if unsure what to do with their hands. A placard beneath reads, "They were the wall that stood when no wall was expected." Each year, new officers stand before that wall during commissioning week. In the silence, they read the names aloud. It is not part of the curriculum. It is tradition. The return to Samar. In 2019, 75 years after the battle, an American destroyer, USS Gabrielle Giffords LCS-10, crossed the coordinates where Johnston had gone down. Her crew held a brief ceremony on the fantail. The chaplain read from a letter written in 1944 by a sailor who had not survived. "If we don't make it back, tell them we fought smart and we fought proud." When he finished, the ship's bell tolled 8 times once for each of the major ships of Taffy 3, and a wreath of red and white flowers was set adrift. The Pacific current caught it spinning slowly, drifting westward toward the deep. One young seaman, barely 20, watched it disappear. Hard to believe, he whispered, they were our age. The weight of example. Naval leaders still invoke Samar in speeches about initiative and integrity. In the age of satellites and guided missiles, when battles are fought from screens instead of bridges, the lesson endures. Decisions still come down to human judgment and moral clarity. During a modern tactical symposium, Admiral John Richardson, then Chief of Naval Operations, summarized it this way: "Technology changes. The sea doesn't. There will always be moments when the math says retreat, but the heart says attack. The men of Taffy 3 remind us which voice we serve. That principle, moral courage above material advantage, remains embedded in naval doctrine under the concept of commander's intent. Officers are taught that in the absence of orders they must act in accordance with purpose. It is the institutional echo of Evans' words, "That's what destroyers are for." Across the divide, the Japanese have not forgotten either. Each October in a small Shinto shrine overlooking the Sato Inland Sea, former sailors of the Imperial Navy and their descendants gather to honor both sides. They burn incense and read names from both crews, American and Japanese alike, then cast folded paper boats into the water. One elderly priest explains to visiting historians, "In the sea there is no enemy, only spirits who obeyed duty." The paper boats drift together, their candles glowing faintly, until the tide claims them. The historian's reckoning, military historians continue to debate Samar's precise strategic value. Some argue it only accelerated an inevitable victory. Others insist it prevented a catastrophic reversal at Leyte that could have prolonged the war by months. But nearly all agree on one point: no act of valor in naval history so completely defied the arithmetic of battle. Professor Craig Simons wrote, "Samar proved that war is fought not in tons and calibers but in conviction. The American destroyers did not merely resist, they reversed the moral momentum of the Pacific." The battle entered textbooks beside Trafalgar Midway and Jutland not for scale, but for soul. The final muster, at the 80th anniversary memorial in 2024, only a handful of Taffy 3 veterans could attend. They sat in wheelchairs under a canvas awning at the Naval Memorial in San Diego, the sea glittering behind them. A destroyer offshore blew a single long blast of her horn. The sound rolled over the water like distant artillery. One old sailor asked what he remembered most, smiled faintly. "The smoke," he said. "Couldn't see a damn thing. But we knew where to go toward the flashes." As the ceremony ended, a young officer approached him and asked, "Sir, what should we remember when it's our turn?" The veteran looked up at the sky. "That you'll never have enough, not enough ships, time, or luck. But if you've got each other, it's enough." Beyond the horizon, when the sun set that evening, its reflection turned the Pacific crimson, then gold, then black. Somewhere far below lay the twisted hulks of Johnston, Hoel, Samuel B. Roberts, and Gambier Bay, silent, eternal, steadfast. On the surface, new ships sailed above them, sleek, radar-bright, bristling with missiles. Yet beneath their decks hung framed photographs of those who came before, young faces frozen in 1944, forever looking forward. The ocean rolled on, unchanging and infinite. The sea forgets names, but not deeds, and on that endless horizon between courage and annihilation, the men of Taffy 3 still stand watch, forever charging into the impossible.